Today, we're going to cover some essential linking words you'll need to describe charts and graphs clearly and effectively.
All right, let's kick things off with our first section, beginning a trend. These are the key phrases you'll use to introduce your data.
So, to start your description, you've got a few great options. You can use initially, which means bando, or you can use time-specific phrases like in the first year, that's chongnamdotin. To state the starting number, you can go with starting at or standing at, which means bado amuk or dung amuk, and if you want to refer directly to the visual, as can be seen in the first year, is a perfect choice. You go te chongnamdotin.
Let's see how initially works in a real sentence. Initially, the percentage of male smokers stood at exactly 50% in 1990, which was significantly higher than the figure for women in the same year.
Here's an example with starting at just 10% in the first year of the period, the figure for renewable energy experienced a sharp rise before reaching its peak a decade later.
Standing at works in a very similar way, giving you a really precise starting point. For instance, standing at 5 million in 2000, the population of the city grew steadily and eventually overtook the rural population.
And if you want to point directly to the chart, you could say something like this. As can be seen in the first year of the surveyed period, car sales were relatively low, hovering at around only 2,000 units per month.
Okay, moving on to section 2, continuing the trend. Let's look at the phrases for describing what happens next in the data.
To show how a trend progresses, you can use words like following this or thereafter, meaning sauda. Subsequently is another great one, meaning nice sauda. For longer time frames, you can say in the subsequent years, that's 종ring남급태우. To mark a clear turning point, use from this point onwards, and another very useful phrase is this was followed by.
Let's look at an example with thereafter. The price of crude oil increased sharply to $50 per barrel, and thereafter, it remained perfectly stable for a period of 3 consecutive years.
Subsequently is great for showing what happens right after. For example, subsequently, the sales of laptops dropped noticeably to 20,000 units, whereas desktop computer sales saw remarkable recovery.
And if you need to talk about a trend over a specific period, you could say, over the next 5 years, the number of international visitors to the museum fluctuated wildly between 1 million and 1.5 million before stabilizing.
From this point onwards is perfect for marking a clear shift in the data. Here's an example. From this point onwards, an upward trend was seen in both categories, with the younger age group showing the most dramatic changes.
And here's how you can use "this was followed by" to connect events. The figure reached a peak of 85% in 2005, and this was followed by a dramatic decline towards the end of the timeline.
All right, on to section 3, which is all about comparing and contrasting. These are the phrases you'll need when you're discussing different data sets.
When you're contrasting data, you've got a few choices. You can use however, tuy or phrases like in contrast and by contrast, which both mean try like. To talk about trends happening at the same time, use meanwhile or on the other hand, which means tronkidat. Another really useful phrase is as opposed to, taingukvoi.
Here's an example of by contrast, showing two things moving in opposite directions. By contrast, while the proportion of male students studying engineering rose steadily, the figure for female students saw a dramatic decline to only 5%.
You use meanwhile when you're talking about trends happening at the same time. For instance, meanwhile, the figure for the UK remained unchanged at exactly 15%, making it the only country with a stable trend throughout the decade. Okay, let's talk about while and whereas. They both mean tromhi, and you use them to connect two opposing ideas within the same complex sentence. Let's see how that works.
Here's a great example using whereas. Whereas the U.S. spent a massive $10 million on higher education, Japan's expenditure was only half that amount, despite having a similar population size. And for a really direct comparison, you can use as opposed to. For example, the number of cars produced by the factory was 100,000, as opposed to only 50,000 motorcycles manufactured in the same year.
And that brings us to our final section, section 4, ending a trend. These are the phrases you'll use to conclude your description.
To wrap things up, you can use summary words like ultimately, finally, or eventually. They all basically mean 고이공. To specify the final point in time, say by the end of the period, cha din koi zaidan. And to state the final number, use phrases like finishing at or ending the period at, which means get took a muk.
Let's see how ultimately works to summarize the final result. Ultimately, despite the initial fluctuations, both categories experienced strong upward trends and reached a shared peak of 80% in 2020.
Now, if you want to refer to the final point in time, you can say, by the end of the period, the average house price in Hanoi had more than doubled compared to the initial figure, reflecting a booming real estate market.
And to give that final number with precision, use finishing at. For example, the upward trend for electric vehicles continued consistently, finishing at exactly 500,000 units in 2015 and officially surpassing traditional cars.
This video is brought to you by the IELTS Focus 08477059973, an English center specializing in IELTS preparation.